Today on Bench Briefs, we're looking at a fascinating and timely decision from the Supreme Court of Canada in Quebec, Attorney General v. Denis, a 2026 case that touches on the delicate balance between provincial authority, freedom of expression, and constitutional rights. This case dives deep into how far a province can go in regulating symbols and public expression, especially when cultural identity is at stake. Here's what happened. The Attorney General of Quebec introduced a new provincial law that placed specific restrictions on how certain symbols and documents could be used and displayed within Quebec. These weren't just any symbols, they were tied closely to Quebec's unique cultural and social fabric. The government said that these restrictions were necessary to preserve the province's distinct identity and social harmony. In other words, Quebec wanted to regulate public expression when it came to these symbols to protect what makes the province special. But not everyone agreed. Denis, an individual directly affected by this legislation, challenged the law. Denis argued that these restrictions violated fundamental freedoms guaranteed by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically freedom of expression. Denis claimed that the law unfairly limited what people could say or show publicly, and that such limitations weren't justified under the Charter. So the Supreme Court had to answer some tough questions. First, did the Quebec law infringe on constitutional rights, especially freedom of expression? If yes, could that infringement be justified under Section 1 of the Charter, which allows certain limits on rights if they are reasonable and demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society? In addition to these charter issues, the court also looked at the division of powers between the federal and provincial governments. Was Quebec's law a valid exercise of provincial authority, or did it cross into federal jurisdiction? The court's analysis was complex but crucial. On the question of freedom of expression, the court recognized that symbols and documents are powerful forms of communication. Restricting their use can significantly impact how people express their beliefs and identities. The court acknowledged the province's interest in protecting its cultural identity, but also emphasized that any limits on expression must be carefully scrutinized. When it came to Section 1 of the Charter, the court applied the usual test to decide if the law's infringement was justified. This includes assessing whether the law had a pressing and substantial objective, whether the means chosen were rationally connected to that objective, and whether the law impaired rights as little as possible. The court found that while protecting Quebec's cultural identity is a valid goal, the specific restrictions imposed were too broad and went beyond what was necessary. In other words, the law was an overreach that unjustifiably limited freedom of expression. On the division of powers issue, the court confirmed that provinces do have the authority to regulate certain aspects of public expression, especially when tied to cultural and social concerns within their borders. However, this authority is not unlimited. The court stressed that provincial laws must respect the constitutional framework and cannot encroach on federal powers or fundamental rights without strong justification. So why does this case matter? Quebec Attorney General v. Denis illustrates the ongoing tension in Canadian constitutional law between protecting cultural distinctiveness and upholding fundamental freedoms. It highlights how courts play a critical role in balancing these sometimes competing values. The decision also reaffirms that while provinces have room to regulate matters of local importance, such as cultural expression, they must do so within constitutional limits, especially when charter rights are at stake. For Canadians, this case is a reminder that freedom of expression is a cornerstone of our democracy, but it is not absolute. Laws that restrict expression must be carefully tailored and justified. At the same time, the case acknowledges the importance of provincial identity and the legitimate interest provinces have in preserving their unique cultural heritage. Thanks for listening to this episode of Bench Briefs. Join us next time as we explore another significant case shaping Canadian law and society. Until then, take care.